On October 19, 1976, more than 2,000 people gathered outside a small church in a quiet, residential neighborhood of Brooklyn. The Church of Our Lady of Grace had never seen anything quite like this. Plainclothes detectives mingled with the crowd. FBI agents snapped photographs of the mourners, and inside a $7,000 bronze coffin held the body of a man who by all appearances had lived a modest and unremarkable life. The deceased was a small, thin man with a prominent nose and gentle eyes. He had lived in a simple row house on Ocean Parkway. He never sought publicity. He never appeared on television. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, elderly gentleman who kept to himself. But the man in that bronze coffin was Carlo Gambino, and, according to federal authorities, he was the most powerful organized crime figure in America. A man who reportedly controlled a criminal empire that generated hundreds of millions of dollars each year. A man who, according to government informants, had given the order for multiple killings with nothing more than a nod of his head. And here is perhaps the most remarkable part of his story. In more than 50 years of alleged criminal activity, Carlo Gambino spent just 22 months in prison. He was never successfully prosecuted for any violent crime, and he died peacefully in his sleep, watching his beloved New York Yankees on television. For a man in his position, this was almost unprecedented. This is the story of Carlo Gambino, the man they called the Quiet Don. Before we begin, it is important to understand what this story represents. This is not a celebration of crime. It is an examination of how one man navigated a violent and corrupt world and what his life tells us about organized crime in 20th century America. Along the way, we will encounter victims whose lives were cut short, communities that were exploited, and a justice system that often struggled to keep pace with criminal enterprise. Their stories deserve to be remembered alongside the history of those who caused them harm. To understand how Carlo Gambino became who he was, we need to travel back to the island of Sicily at the turn of the 20th century. Carlo was born on August 24, 1902 in the city of Palermo, the capital of Sicily. His family actually came from a smaller town called Caccamo, about 50 kilometers to the southeast. His father was Tommaso Gambino, and his mother was Felice Castellano. Carlo had two brothers, Gaspare, who would later live a conventional life away from organized crime, and Paolo, who would eventually join his brother in America and in the criminal underworld. The Gambino family, according to historical records, had connections to what was then called the Onorata Società, or the Honored Society. This was the name given to the Sicilian Mafia during that era. While the details of Carlo's early years remain murky, what is documented is that by the time he was a teenager, he had already become involved in the criminal activities of local mafia figures. In 1921, when Carlo was just 19 years old, he reportedly became what is known as a made man, a full member of the Sicilian Mafia. This initiation, according to later testimony from government informants, involved blood oaths and promises of loyalty that were meant to last a lifetime. That same year, Carlo made a decision that would change the course of his life. He decided to leave Sicily for America. The reasons for his departure were likely twofold. Sicily in the early 1920s was experiencing political upheaval. Benito Mussolini was rising to power in Italy, and one of his stated goals was the complete destruction of the Sicilian Mafia. Within a few years, Mussolini would launch a brutal campaign against organized crime on the island, imprisoning thousands. For young men like Carlo Gambino, America offered an escape. The journey itself was harrowing. Carlo did not travel as a legitimate passenger. According to historical accounts, he stowed away aboard the SS Vincenzo Florio, hiding below decks for the long transatlantic voyage. Some sources describe him surviving the journey on little more than anchovies and wine, spending weeks in darkness and uncertainty, never knowing if he would be discovered and thrown overboard or if he would make it to the shores of a new country. On December 23, 1921, Carlo arrived in Norfolk, Virginia, aboard the SS Vincenzo Florio. He entered the United States illegally without proper documentation. This fact would haunt him for the rest of his life, as federal authorities would repeatedly attempt to deport him, ultimately without success. From Virginia, Carlo made his way north to New York City, where members of his extended family, the Castellanos, had already established themselves. He arrived in a city that was in the grip of prohibition. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution had banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the United States. But rather than stopping Americans from drinking, prohibition created an enormous black market. And for organized crime, it represented an unprecedented opportunity. Whoever controlled the illegal liquor trade could generate enormous profits. And those profits attracted ambitious young men willing to break the law to get them. Carlo Gambino found work in the criminal underworld almost immediately. According to federal records, he started at the bottom, working as a truck driver for bootlegging operations. He delivered illegal alcohol throughout the city, learning the business from the ground up. But Carlo was different from many of his peers. He was quiet where others were boastful. He was patient where others were impulsive. And he watched. He observed how power worked in the underworld. He noted who rose and who fell, and more importantly, why. During these years, Carlo became associated with a group of young, ambitious criminals who would later be known as the Young Turks. They included names that would become legendary in the annals of organized crime: Charles Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, and Albert Anastasia. These men saw themselves as a new generation. They were more Americanized than the older Sicilian bosses. They were willing to work across ethnic lines, partnering with Jewish gangsters like Lansky and Siegel. And they believed that organized crime could be run more like a corporation with rational decision-making, replacing old-world vendettas. In 1926, at the age of 24, Carlo married his first cousin, Catherine Castellano. In Sicilian culture of that era, such marriages were not unusual. They strengthened family bonds and ensured loyalty. Catherine was the sister of Paul Castellano, who would later play a crucial role in the Gambino family's history. Carlo and Catherine would have 4 children together: 3 sons, Thomas Joseph and Carlo Jr., and a daughter, Phyllis. Despite his involvement in the criminal underworld, those who knew Carlo described him as a devoted family man. He kept his family life separate from his business, and he was rarely seen at the restaurants and nightclubs where other gangsters held court. By the late 1920s, the Italian-American underworld in New York was dominated by 2 powerful figures. Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, controlled the largest and most powerful faction. He was a traditional Sicilian boss, demanding absolute loyalty and a cut of every criminal enterprise in the city. Challenging him was Salvatore Maranzano, who had arrived from the Sicilian town of Castellammarese del Golfo. Maranzano fancied himself a Roman emperor in the making. He studied ancient military tactics and saw himself as destined to unite all Italian-American criminals under his leadership. The tension between these 2 men exploded into open warfare in early 1930. The conflict would become known as the Castellammarese War, named after Maranzano's hometown. The fighting lasted for more than a year. Gunmen on both sides fell in ambushes and assassinations. The streets of New York became a battleground. And caught in the middle were men like Carlo Gambino, who had to choose sides and try to survive. Carlo was initially aligned with Masseria, but as the war dragged on, it became clear that Masseria was losing ground. His men were defecting, his alliances were crumbling, and a group of young gangsters led by Lucky Luciano began to see that neither of the old bosses offered a path forward. Luciano proposed a radical solution. He would betray his own boss, Masseria, in exchange for peace. The older generation, the so-called Mustache Petes, would be swept away, and a new order would take their place. Carlo Gambino reportedly agreed to this plan. On April 15, 1931, Joe Masseria went to lunch with Lucky Luciano at a restaurant called Nuova Via Tamaro in Coney Island. They ate, they drank, and they played cards. At some point, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. While he was gone, according to police reports and later testimony, 4 gunmen entered the restaurant. They included Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Siegel. Masseria was shot multiple times and died at the scene. When police arrived, Luciano was found calmly waiting in the restaurant. He claimed to know nothing about what had happened. With Masseria dead, Maranzano emerged as the victor of the Castellammarese War. He convened a meeting of mob leaders and announced a new structure for organized crime in New York. There would be 5 families each with its own boss, underboss, and hierarchy of captains and soldiers. Maranzano would serve as the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. But Maranzano's reign was destined to be short. He had made a crucial mistake. He had begun planning to eliminate those he saw as threats to his power, including Lucky Luciano. Luciano learned of these plans, and on September 10, 1931, less than 5 months after Massaria's death, Maranzano was killed in his office on Park Avenue. A team of gunmen recruited by Meyer Lansky and disguised as federal agents shot and stabbed him to death. With both Massaria and Maranzano gone, Luciano became the most powerful organized crime figure in New York. But he had learned from the mistakes of his predecessors. He did not proclaim himself boss of all bosses. Instead, he established what became known as the Commission, a governing body, where the heads of the major families would meet as equals to resolve disputes and coordinate their activities. The 5 families of New York were now established. They would eventually become known by the names of their most prominent bosses. The Genovese family, originally led by Luciano himself, the Lucchese family, the Bonanno family, the Colombo family, then known as the Profaci family, and the family that would eventually carry the Gambino name. This structure, created in 1931, would prove remarkably durable. It survived for decades, outlasting the men who created it. The Commission met regularly to resolve territorial disputes, authorize leadership changes, and most importantly, to prevent the kind of all-out warfare that had characterized the Castellammarese conflict. Murder was still a tool of the trade, but now it required approval, a consensus among the bosses that a killing was necessary. Carlo Gambino, still in his late 20s, had survived the bloodbath. He was assigned to the family headed by Vincent Mangano and began his slow, patient climb through the ranks. For the next 2 decades, Carlo Gambino worked his way up the hierarchy of the Mangano family. He became a captain commanding his own crew of soldiers. He developed profitable rackets in the garment industry, the waterfront, and illegal gambling. And he cultivated relationships with powerful figures both inside and outside the underworld. When the United States entered World War II, Carlo found new opportunities. The federal government had established a system of rationing for essential goods like gasoline, meat, and rubber. Each citizen received ration stamps that limited how much they could purchase. According to federal records, Carlo and his associates obtained large quantities of these stamps through bribery of government officials. They then sold the stamps on the black market at enormous profits. While millions of Americans sacrificed during the war years, men like Carlo Gambino reportedly got rich. During this period, Carlo maintained a low profile. He avoided the spotlight that attracted other gangsters. He dressed modestly, he lived in a simple home, and he waited. In 1951, an event occurred that would reshape the power structure of the New York underworld. Vincent Mangano and his brother Philip had long been in conflict with their underboss, Albert Anastasia. The tension had been building for years. On April 19, 1951, both Mangano brothers disappeared. Philip's body was later found in a marshland in Jamaica Bay. Brooklyn shot 3 times. Vincent was never found. Albert Anastasia appeared before the commission and claimed that the Mangano brothers had been planning to kill him. He said he had acted in self-defense. No one believed him, but no one could prove otherwise. Anastasia was confirmed as the new boss of the family. And Carlo Gambino was promoted to underboss, the second most powerful position in the organization. Working directly under Albert Anastasia was a dangerous proposition. Anastasia had earned the nickname Lord High Executioner during his years running Murder Incorporated, an assassination squad that reportedly carried out hundreds of killings on behalf of organized crime. He was volatile, prone to sudden rages, and deeply suspicious of those around him. In March 1952, an event occurred that illustrated just how dangerous Anastasia could be, and more importantly, how the world of organized crime could reach out and destroy innocent lives. Arnold Schuster was 24 years old. He worked as a clothing salesman in Brooklyn and lived with his parents on 45th Street. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary young man trying to make his way in the world. He had served in the Coast Guard. He was interested in crime stories and fancied himself something of an amateur detective. On February 18, 1952, Arnold was riding the subway when he recognized a fellow passenger. It was Willie Sutton, a notorious bank robber who had been on the FBI's most wanted list. Sutton was a legend of sorts, famous for his daring escapes from prison and his reported quip when asked why he robbed banks: "Because that's where the money is." Arnold followed Sutton off the train at the Pacific Street stop in Park Slope. He watched as Sutton tried to start a car that wouldn't run, then went to get a new battery. Arnold flagged down a passing police car and reported what he had seen. Sutton was arrested, and Arnold Schuster briefly became a local celebrity, appearing on television to discuss how he had helped capture the famous criminal. He met the police commissioner. He gave interviews. He was held up as an example of civic virtue, a young man who had done his duty. But Willie Sutton had no connections to organized crime. He was a lone wolf, a bank robber who worked independently. Nevertheless, according to testimony later provided by government informant Joseph Valachi, Albert Anastasia watched one of Schuster's television interviews and became enraged. According to Valachi, Anastasia shouted, "I can't stand squealers," and ordered his men to kill Schuster. On March 8, 1952, Arnold Schuster was walking home from work when a lone gunman approached him on a dark Brooklyn street. He was shot multiple times and died on the sidewalk just a few doors from his parents' home. He was 24 years old. The manner of his death was particularly brutal. He was shot in the groin and in both eyes, a message to anyone who might consider cooperating with law enforcement. Arnold Schuster's parents had to identify their son's body. His father, Max Schuster, spoke to reporters through his grief. "He was a good boy," he said. "He only did what any good citizen should do." Arnold Schuster was an innocent man. He had done nothing more than what millions of Americans are taught is their civic duty. He had helped the police catch a criminal, and for that, according to testimony given under oath, he was murdered. The case was never officially solved. No one was ever prosecuted for Arnold Schuster's death. His family sued New York City for failing to protect him, and the case eventually resulted in a landmark legal ruling that established the government's duty to protect citizens who cooperate with law enforcement. The murder of Arnold Schuster reportedly created significant tension within the world of organized crime. Such a high-profile killing of an innocent civilian attracted exactly the kind of attention that men like Carlo Gambino tried to avoid. It brought heat from law enforcement and outrage from the public. Over the next several years, according to later testimony and historical accounts, Carlo Gambino began to quietly maneuver against his boss. By 1957, Albert Anastasia had made enemies throughout the underworld. His unpredictable violence made him a liability, and ambitious men like Vito Genovese saw an opportunity to reshape the power structure of organized crime. According to testimony and historical records, Carlo Gambino reached an understanding with Genovese. If Anastasia were removed, Gambino would take his place as boss of the family. In return, Gambino would support Genovese's ambitions. On May 2, 1957, Frank Costello, who was allied with Anastasia, survived an assassination attempt. A gunman shot him outside his apartment building, but the bullet only grazed his head. Costello understood the message. He announced his retirement from the criminal underworld. With Costello out of the picture, Anastasia stood alone. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia arrived at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. He entered the barbershop on the ground floor, a place called Grasso's, and settled into chair number 4 for a shave and a haircut. His bodyguard, Anthony Coppola, was not with him. According to various accounts, Coppola had stepped away for a walk at the precise moment his services would have been needed. At approximately 10:20 in the morning, 2 men wearing scarves over their faces entered the barbershop. They pushed the barber aside and opened fire. Anastasia, according to news reports and police accounts, tried to fight back. In his confusion and pain, he allegedly lunged at the figures he saw in the mirror, attacking their reflections rather than the gunmen themselves. 10 shots were fired. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, the man who had ordered the deaths of countless others, died on the floor of that barbershop. His body was found wrapped in white towels, his blood pooling on the checkered floor. Photographs of the crime scene appeared in newspapers across the country. They showed a body crumpled on the floor, the mundane setting of a hotel barbershop transformed into a tableau of violence. For many Americans, these images were among the first they had ever seen of real mob violence. The case was never officially solved. Various theories have been proposed about who carried out the killing. One persistent account based on statements made years later suggested involvement by members of the Profassi crime family. Joe Gallo allegedly boasted about his role, reportedly telling a journalist, "You can just call the five of us the barbershop quintet." But what is known with certainty is who benefited from Anastasia's death. Within days, Carlo Gambino was confirmed as the new boss of what would become known as the Gambino crime family. Just 3 weeks after the Anastasia murder, an event occurred that would have profound consequences for organized crime in America. On November 14, 1957, approximately 100 men gathered at a rural estate in Apalachin, New York, about 200 miles northwest of New York City. The property belonged to Joseph Barbara, a mob associate who distributed Canada Dry beverages as his legitimate business. The meeting had been called by Vito Genovese, who wanted the other crime bosses to formally recognize his position of leadership. Carlo Gambino attended, as did leaders from organized crime families across the country. They came from Chicago, Buffalo, Los Angeles, Tampa, and other cities. Some reports indicate that representatives even came from Sicily and Cuba. The estate was secluded, set on 53 acres of land in a quiet community where expensive out-of-town visitors would not normally attract attention. Barbara had hosted similar gatherings before. The men arrived in black Cadillacs and Lincolns, the preferred automobiles of successful criminals in that era. But a local state trooper named Edgar Croswell had been keeping an eye on Barbara's property for some time. When he noticed dozens of expensive cars with out-of-state license plates converging on the estate, he called for backup. When the mob leaders realized that police were approaching, chaos erupted. Some fled into the surrounding woods. Others tried to drive away. Many were caught and detained. In the end, 58 men were arrested. Though no charges ultimately stuck, the damage was done. The Apalachin Meeting made national headlines. It provided undeniable proof that organized crime existed as a national network with leaders who coordinated their activities across state lines. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly denied the existence of a nationwide crime syndicate. After Apalachin, he could no longer maintain that fiction. He was forced to establish what became known as the Top Hoodlum Program, directing FBI resources toward investigating organized crime for the first time. The meeting was a disaster for Vito Genovese. Instead of being crowned as the supreme leader of organized crime, he became a target for law enforcement and an object of ridicule within the underworld. And, according to later accounts, Carlo Gambino played a role in what came next. In 1959, Vito Genovese was arrested on narcotics charges. The key witness against him was a low-level drug dealer named Nelson Cantaloups, who claimed to have witnessed Genovese personally handling heroin shipments. According to some historical accounts, this testimony was arranged by Genovese's rivals, including Gambino, who allegedly paid Cantaloups $100,000 to implicate the mob boss. Genovese was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He would die there in 1969, still insisting on his innocence. With Genovese removed, Carlo Gambino emerged as the most powerful organized crime figure in America. He had achieved this position not through violence, but through patience, strategy, and an uncanny ability to let his rivals destroy themselves. For the next nearly 2 decades, Carlo Gambino presided over what federal authorities considered the most powerful crime family in the nation. The scope of the Gambino organization's alleged activities was staggering. According to law enforcement estimates, the family generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually from a wide range of enterprises, both legal and illegal. At the core were the traditional rackets. Illegal gambling operations generated steady income with relatively low risk. Loan sharking, the practice of lending money at exorbitant interest rates and enforcing collection through intimidation and violence, provided another revenue stream. Extortion, the simple but effective practice of demanding payment in exchange for protection from violence, continued as it had for generations. But the Gambino organization also controlled significant portions of legitimate industries. According to federal investigations, the family had influence over garment manufacturing in Manhattan, controlling trucking companies and unions that moved goods in and out of the garment district. They allegedly controlled aspects of the construction industry, determining which companies could bid on contracts and taking a cut of the proceeds. Perhaps most significantly, the Gambino family reportedly controlled portions of the shipping and trucking operations at John F. Kennedy International Airport and the New York waterfront. These were choke points for the movement of goods in and out of the nation's largest city. Control over these operations meant the ability to demand tribute from legitimate businesses to facilitate the movement of stolen goods and to generate enormous profits from what appeared on the surface to be ordinary commercial activity. According to some estimates, the Gambino family at its peak controlled a workforce of more than 1,000 maid members and associates. But you would never have known this from looking at Carlo Gambino's lifestyle. He continued to live in the same modest row house on Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn that he had occupied for years. He spent summers at a waterfront property in Massapequa on Long Island, but even this home was relatively unpretentious compared to the mansions of other successful businessmen. Carlo dressed simply. He avoided nightclubs and restaurants. He conducted much of his business through quiet conversations, often saying nothing at all. According to FBI surveillance reports, agents once recorded a meeting between Gambino and two of his associates in which virtually nothing of substance was said aloud. Gambino communicated through nods, shrugs, and meaningful silences. When one associate mentioned a name, Gambino simply nodded. The agents later concluded that this nod was an authorization for murder. Throughout the 1960s, Carlo Gambino successfully evaded prosecution despite being the subject of intense federal investigation. He was arrested 16 times over his career, but managed to avoid serious prison time after his 22-month sentence in the late 1930s. In 1963, the world of organized crime was exposed to the public as never before when Joseph Valachi testified before a Senate committee. Valachi was a low-ranking soldier in the Genovese family who, fearing for his life after killing a fellow prisoner he mistakenly believed was an assassin, agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. Valachi's background was unremarkable by mob standards. He had been a foot soldier his entire career, never rising above the rank of ordinary member. He had participated in murders. He had run small-time rackets. He was exactly the kind of man that bosses like Carlo Gambino would never notice. But when Vito Genovese, who was imprisoned alongside Valachi, gave him what Valachi believed was the kiss of death, a traditional signal that a member had been marked for execution, Valachi decided he had nothing left to lose. His testimony was broadcast on national television. Millions of Americans watched as he described the inner workings of what he called La Cosa Nostra, our thing. He explained the initiation rituals, the hierarchy of bosses and soldiers, and the code of silence known as Omerta. He named Carlo Gambino as one of the 5 bosses who controlled organized crime in New York. The hearings were presided over by Senator John McClellan of Arkansas. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who had made fighting organized crime a priority, watched with satisfaction as Valachi's testimony validated years of FBI intelligence that had previously been kept from the public. For the first time, the American public had a detailed inside account of how the Mafia actually operated. The testimony led to new legislation including the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, which would eventually become the primary tool for prosecuting organized crime. But Valachi's testimony did not directly result in the prosecution of Carlo Gambino or other top bosses. The information was valuable for intelligence purposes, but it could not be used as evidence in court. Gambino continued to operate. In 1969, federal authorities finally seemed to have a case against him. Carlo was indicted for conspiracy to rob an armored truck carrying $6 million, but the case was repeatedly delayed due to Gambino's declining health. His lawyers argued that he was too ill to stand trial, and sympathetic judges agreed to postponement after postponement. The Supreme Court upheld an order for Gambino's deportation in 1970, ruling that he had entered the country illegally nearly 50 years earlier, but his doctors testified that his heart condition made the journey to Italy too dangerous. Once again, the legal process ground to a halt. In 1972, a film was released that would become one of the most celebrated movies in cinema history. The Godfather, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and based on the novel by Mario Puzo, told the story of a fictional crime family headed by a character named Vito Corleone. The character of Vito Corleone was not based on any single real person, Puzo drew inspiration from multiple organized crime figures, including Frank Costello, Joseph Prefaci, and Carlo Gambino himself. Like Gambino, Vito Corleone was portrayed as a quiet, thoughtful man who lived modestly despite his enormous power. Like Gambino, he died of a heart attack while spending time with his grandchildren. The Godfather romanticized organized crime in ways that real-life victims would find deeply troubling. But it also reflected certain truths about how men like Carlo Gambino operated. The film showed that success in the underworld often came not to the most violent men, but to those who were most patient and most strategic. In 1971, Carlo suffered a personal loss when his wife Catherine died. They had been married for 45 years. Those who knew him said he was devastated. His own health was failing. He had suffered multiple heart attacks and was increasingly frail. The FBI maintained surveillance on his Brooklyn home, but there was less and less to observe. The old Don was fading. Before his death, Carlo made a decision that would have profound consequences for his crime family. He had to choose a successor. The obvious choice was Agnello Della Croce, his underboss. Della Croce was a traditional mobster, a tough man who had come up through the ranks and commanded the respect of the street soldiers. He represented the old ways. But Carlo chose differently. He named his brother-in-law Paul Castellano as his successor. Castellano was a different kind of boss. He was a businessman more interested in white-collar crime and legitimate enterprises than in the traditional rackets of gambling and loan sharking. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island that employees called the White House. He wore expensive suits and rarely mingled with the lower ranks of the organization. This decision effectively split the Gambino family into two factions. Castellano would control the business operations, while Della Croce would oversee the traditional criminal activities. It was an arrangement that satisfied no one completely. On the evening of October 14, 1976, Carlo Gambino sat in his home in Massapequa, watching the New York Yankees play in the American League Championship Series. The Yankees won, securing their place in the World Series for the first time in 12 years. It was a good night for Carlo. He was a lifelong Yankees fan. Sometime in the early morning hours of October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino suffered a massive heart attack. He died in his sleep. He was 74 years old. His funeral 4 days later was unlike anything Brooklyn had seen. The service was held at the Church of Our Lady of Grace, and attendance was by invitation only. Nevertheless, more than 2,000 people gathered outside. FBI agents photographed the mourners trying to identify who had come to pay their respects. The bronze coffin cost $7,000. Carlo was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens in a private family vault next to his wife, Catherine. Carlo Gambino had achieved something that few men in his position ever accomplish. He had risen to the top of a violent and treacherous world and had died peacefully in his own bed. He had built an organization that bore his name and that would continue to operate long after his death. But his legacy was not peace. The decision to name Paul Castellano as his successor proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Castellano's leadership style alienated many in the organization, particularly a rising captain named John Gotti, who had been a protege of Agnello Della Croce. In December 1985, less than a decade after Carlo's death, Paul Castellano was shot to death outside a Manhattan steakhouse. The killing was orchestrated by John Gotti, who then declared himself the new boss of the Gambino family. Gotti was everything that Carlo Gambino was not. He was flashy, flamboyant, and sought the spotlight. He gave interviews to reporters and posed for photographs. The media called him the Dapper Don. But Gotti's love of publicity would be his undoing. In 1992, he was convicted on multiple charges, including murder and racketeering, largely based on recordings made by an FBI bug and the testimony of his former underboss, Salvatore Gravano. John Gotti died in prison in 2002. The Gambino crime family still exists today, though it is a shadow of what it was during Carlo's reign. Federal prosecutions under the RICO statute have decimated its leadership. The old codes of silence have been repeatedly broken by members seeking to reduce their own sentences. Where Carlo Gambino valued secrecy above all else, his successors seemed unable to resist the spotlight. The FBI estimates that the Gambino family, once the most powerful organized crime entity in America, now operates with a fraction of its former influence. Many of its traditional rackets have been taken over by other criminal organizations, some of them from overseas. The old Italian-American monopoly on organized crime in New York has been broken. But organized crime itself has not disappeared. It has evolved, adapted, and found new opportunities. Drug trafficking, cybercrime, and international criminal networks have replaced some of the old rackets. The struggle continues even as the specific players change. Looking back at Carlo Gambino's life, it is impossible to separate the man from the crimes attributed to him and his organization. Whatever his personal qualities, he was, according to decades of federal investigation, at the center of an enterprise that caused immense harm. The victims of organized crime are often forgotten. They include not only those who lost their lives like Arnold Schuster, but also the countless workers whose unions were corrupted, the businesses that were extorted, and the communities that were poisoned by drugs and gambling. Carlo Gambino died wealthy and surrounded by family. Most of his victims were not so fortunate. What remains of Carlo Gambino now is his name attached to an organization that continues to appear in headlines whenever another member is arrested or another former associate decides to cooperate with authorities. The Gambino crime family endures as a reminder that organized crime, despite decades of law enforcement effort, has never been fully eliminated from American life. But perhaps the more important legacy lies not with the criminals, but with those who oppose them. The Arnold Schuster case led to landmark legal decisions about the government's duty to protect citizens who cooperate with law enforcement. The Apalachin Meeting forced federal agencies to finally confront the reality of organized crime. The Valachi hearings led to RICO and the Witness Protection Program tools that would eventually be used to dismantle much of the old mafia structure. And thousands of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and ordinary citizens continued to stand against organized crime despite the risks. Some of them paid with their lives. Others spent careers building cases, one piece of evidence at a time. The man they called the Quiet Don built an empire on silence. But the consequences of what he built continue to echo long after his death. In the end, Carlo Gambino's story is not really about one man. It is about a system that allowed organized crime to flourish for decades and about the slow, difficult process of dismantling that system. It is about the victims who were silenced and about the witnesses who finally found the courage to speak. It is about the ongoing struggle between those who would profit from crime and those who seek justice. That struggle continues today,